Thank you. Thank you, Erin, for your stories. I'm going to share with you my version of a Russian folk tale, an old tale. Once upon a time, there were two siblings, a sister and a brother, who grew up very miserably poor in a wretched village. Now, when the brother became a young man, he left the village and apprenticed himself to a merchant, and in time became a rich merchant himself and built a grand house in town and never once looked back to the village he had come from, nor to the sister he had left behind. Now, when his sister became a young woman, she had become a talented seamstress. But there was little she could do with that talent but make and mostly patch and mend her own clothes. She had few options, really only one, and that was to marry one of the men of the village. And so she did. But the man she married was a ne'er-do-well. And though he spoke of great plans and a promise to do this and that, he did very little. Until the day came when he left and never came back. And the woman was left with 5 children and really not much of a way to provide for them at all. She did what she could, but the day came when she had not even a crust of bread to feed her children with. And she felt the cold and clammy hands of sorrow reaching about her neck as she thought, how was she to survive? How were her children to survive? But then she thought of her brother, whom she had heard tell was in town, a rich merchant. Surely if she went to her brother and told him how poorly she and her family were doing, surely if she begged for help, he would help her. She shook off the grasping fingers of sorrow and determined to go into town. She went to her brother's house, his grand house, and begged him to help her. And he agreed if she would work a week for him. And so she did. She worked as hard as she could. She mucked out the stables. She chopped the firewood, enough wood to see him and his household through the rest of that winter and into the next. She polished every piece of silver in her brother's house. And at the end of that week, her brother gave her in payment 1 loaf of bread. And the woman felt the weight of sorrow creeping upon her back and pressing down upon her shoulders. Yet she thanked her brother and turned to go home to her children with this loaf of bread, when her brother called out, "Oh, I almost forgot. Tomorrow is my name day and I am throwing a party. You must come back. You must come to the party. You cannot possibly want me to come to your party. You are a fine, rich merchant. Your friends are surely rich merchants with fur coats and boots upon their feet, while I have nothing but cloth shoes and, well, you see, my own clothes that are patched." And yet her brother insisted that she come. And so she agreed, with a little hope in her heart, lifting off some of the grasping of the sorrow's clammy hands upon her. She went home to her children, and she cut off the crusts of the bread to feed them, and then she took the rest of the loaf and cut it up and made bread pudding out of it to take to her brother's house. For how could she go back to her brother's house for a party without bringing something? And so the next day she left in her least patched and mended clothes with the bread pudding, which she offered to her brother when he answered the door. And he took the bread pudding and gave it to his servants to eat, for it did not fit with the spread that he had for his guests of rich meats, exotic fruits, and all sorts of sweetmeats, cakes and puddings, and plenty of fine wine. He sat his sister in a dark corner and he served all of his guests, but he forgot to serve anything to his sister. At the end of the party, all of his guests, with full bellies and heads dizzy with wine, left the house singing as they took their carts and horses back to their homes. All except for his sister, who left with empty belly and the full weight of sorrow upon her shoulders, pulling her shoulders down and slowing her steps as she walked home. As she walked, she heard a voice at the back of her head saying, You should sing too and make merry." Why should I make merry? My brother has treated me abominably. I am starving and I have nothing. But if you were to sing, no one would know your shame. And the woman was shamed and embarrassed by her brother's treatment of her. And so she began to sing. And as she sang, that voice from the back of her head, that thin, reedy voice, seemed to sing along with her. As she stopped to listen, and the voice stopped too. "Is that you, Sorrow?" Yes, yes, it is I, your loyal companion. I will be with you always. And so it was. Sorrow was upon her from that day forth. She went home to her children with nothing to give them, no food, and no longer any hope or energy. Sorrow weighed her down and kept her in bed. And when she could force herself up, she could not do much but sit, roused not even by the cries and begging of her children. But there was one thing that could motivate her to move. It was that voice of sorrow speaking to her, saying, "Oh, I am so hungry. I am so thirsty. You must feed me." But I have nothing. You know, I have nothing. Oh, but you have half a fur. What need have you of half a fur? Winter is almost over. Go sell it in the market, in town, where you can get some of those meats, exotic fruits, those sweetmeats such as your brother did not serve you. And so the woman took her half fur and sold it for sweet treats, exotic fruits that cost so much. It did not go far and was not as nourishing as what else she might have gotten. And as time went on, things went from bad to worse, as Sorrow kept begging to be fed such sweets and treats. And every single thing that she had of even minimal value was sold. And even her children, she could not support or feed. She indentured out as servants. And her own hut and was barely holding up on its own, and been sold off to a neighbor for a pittance, until truly she had nothing left but the sorrow that was upon her. And still sorrow called out, "You must feed me. I am so hungry. I'm so thirsty. I have nothing. You can see I have nothing. My children are gone. My house isn't even my own, and it's still falling about my head." And Sorrow could see it was so. But Sorrow had such a great hunger, and it was also clever. Borrow a cart from a neighbor, and I will take you somewhere where we might get something so that you might properly feed me. So the woman borrowed a cart from a neighbor, and Sorrow led her out to the edges of that wretched village where there was a field with a huge boulder in the middle of it. The woman knew this field. It'd been a long time since she'd been out there, but when she was a child, she and her brother would play on that boulder. And as she had grown older and her brother had left, sometimes she had gone out to that boulder to sit and sew and dream of another place, of another life. But it had been a long time since she had been there. But Sorrow had no interest in these memories. Sorrow had no interest in this boulder, but to move it. Move, push that boulder out of the way. Let us see what is underneath it in the ground. Well, the woman tried to move the boulder. She pushed with what strength she had, but she had little left. And most of that was sapped by the weight of sorrow upon her back. I cannot possibly move it on my own. I have not the strength. And so Sorrow got off her back. And together, the woman and Sorrow, together they pushed and they pushed and they pushed until the boulder rolled off of the earth it had been resting on. And there underneath was a pit filled with gold, more gold coins than the woman had ever seen in one place in her life. She and Sorrow grabbed up handfuls of that gold to transfer it into the cart, one after another. They were so much gold. It took them a long time. It was hard work. And yet, with Sorrow no longer on her back, the woman's back straightened and her shoulders released down and her head started to feel clearer without the whisperings of sorrow in her ears. And she felt good, better than she'd felt in a long, long time. And she looked over at Sorrow, there by the cart, biting on one of those gold coins. And she could see by the look in its eye that Sorrow had plenty of plans for that gold for itself. And those plans were not likely to be good for her. She looked back into the hole in the ground, and all the gold was gone. It was empty. But even so, she called out to Sorrow, "Come, quick, you are much stronger than I think there is more gold there at the bottom." No, I have it all. No, the sun caught light of something down there. I think there's more buried underneath. You're so much stronger and more limber. Please go into the hole and dig for some more. And Sorrow, enticed by the promise of more gold, went into the hole. And as soon as Sorrow was in the hole, the woman, with all the returning strength of her body and determination, pushed the boulder back over that hole, trapping sorrow underneath in the belly of the earth. And with sorrow no longer upon her, she took that money and she bought some land, a woods, and built a comfortable home. She paid off the indentures of her children, welcomed them home with tears and requests, begging for forgiveness. She bought a cow and chickens, sheep, and fine threads, colored flosses of embroidery. And she took up her sewing again and started to make more than just what she needed to wear. And everyone in that wretched village who needed help, she gave it. Until in time, the woman and the entire village became prosperous and a true community. And at times, the woman would take her sewing and embroidery and go back to that boulder and sit upon it as she did her needlework, giving thanks to the earth that held sorrow in its belly, and thanks to sorrow, for it too had given her the gift of empathy, compassion, and yes, gold coins.